"What are you doing with your thumb, old-timer? That's not how you hold a rifle." The instructor's voice carried across the outdoor range, drawing snickers from the dozen students in the weekend precision rifle course. A 73-year-old man with weathered hands and faded blue eyes simply adjusted his position behind the Remington 700, his left thumb wrapped firmly over the top of the handguard, pressing down with deliberate purpose. The younger shooters exchanged glances, some already filming with their phones, ready to capture what they assumed would be an embarrassing miss. What happened next would silence every critic on that firing line and deliver a lesson about respecting the old ways that none of them would ever forget. If you believe in honouring those who carried rifles in service to this nation, type respect in the comments before we continue. The man's name was Eugene Harwell, though most who knew him simply called him Gene. He had signed up for the 3-day precision rifle course at the Blue Ridge Shooting Academy, not because he needed instruction, but because his grandson had given it to him as a birthday present, hoping it would get him out of the house after his wife of 51 years had passed the previous winter. Gene had been reluctant at first. He hadn't fired a rifle competitively in over 40 years, and his arthritis made the prone position more challenging than it once was. But his grandson had spent good money, and Gene wasn't the type to waste a gift. So there he was, on a Saturday morning in late September, surrounded by men half his age or younger, all of them bristling with expensive optics and custom chassis systems, all of them eager to learn from the Academy's head instructor, a former Army Ranger named Kyle Mercer, who had built a substantial following on social media with his no-nonsense approach to modern shooting technique. Kyle was a competent instructor in many respects. He had deployed 3 times to Afghanistan, earned his expert infantryman badge, and completed multiple competitive shooting courses with respectable finishes. He knew ballistics, understood wind calls, and could break down the mechanics of trigger control with genuine expertise. But Kyle also had a weakness common to many who had learned their craft in a particular era. He believed that anything predating his own training was inherently obsolete. When he saw Gene's thumb resting over the bore of the rifle, pressing the handguard down into the sandbag, something in him recoiled. This was wrong. This was outdated. This was exactly the kind of thing he had been trained to correct. "Sir, I need you to reposition your support hand," Kyle said, walking over to Gene's station while the other students watched. "That thumb-over-bore grip hasn't been taught in decades. You're creating unnecessary tension and interfering with natural point of aim." Gene looked up at the instructor, his expression neither defensive nor embarrassed. There was something in those pale blue eyes that Kyle didn't recognize. Something patient and still, like water so deep you couldn't see the bottom. "I appreciate the feedback," Gene said quietly, his voice carrying the soft rasp of age and the flattened vowels of rural North Carolina. "But if it's all the same to you, I'd like to keep my grip the way it is." Kyle felt a flush of irritation. He had dealt with stubborn students before, usually older men who thought their hunting experience qualified them to ignore professional instruction. "Look, I understand you probably learned this a long time ago, but the science of shooting has evolved. The modern technique uses a C-clamp or a vertical grip with the thumb indexed along the side. What you're doing went out with the Vietnam War." Several students laughed at this. Gene did not. He simply nodded once slowly, as if Kyle had confirmed something he already suspected. "The Vietnam War," Gene repeated. "You think that's where this technique went out?" Kyle crossed his arms. "It's just not effective, sir. I've tested it extensively. The downward pressure creates torque, throws off your horizontal tracking, and limits your ability to transition between targets quickly." Gene considered this for a moment. Then he reached into the breast pocket of his flannel shirt and pulled out a small notebook, its cover worn smooth by decades of handling. He opened it to a page near the middle and handed it to Kyle without a word. The instructor looked down at what appeared to be handwritten notes, diagrams and calculations covering everything from wind drift to bullet drop at various ranges. But it was the header at the top of the page that made Kyle's eyebrows rise. Written in neat block letters were the words, "Shooting Notes, Instruction from Gunnery Sergeant Hathcock, Camp Lejeune, 1969. Kyle stared at the name. Hathcock, Carlos Hathcock, the White Feather, 93 confirmed kills in Vietnam, the man who had crawled for 3 days across an open field to eliminate a North Vietnamese general. the most legendary sniper in the history of the United States Marine Corps. Kyle looked up from the notebook, his expression shifting from skepticism to something approaching disbelief. "You trained with Carlos Hathcock?" Jean nodded again with that same unhurried patience. "I was a lance corporal in 1st Marine Division, assigned to the Scout Sniper School at Camp Lejeune in 1969. Gunny Hathcock was one of our primary instructors before his medical retirement. He taught us this grip personally, said he'd used it for every kill he ever made in Vietnam." The firing line had gone completely silent. Phones that had been raised to capture an old man's embarrassment were now recording something else entirely. Kyle handed the notebook back, his jaw tight. He was a professional, and professionals adapted when new information emerged. But this was more than new information. This was a direct challenge to everything he had been teaching for the past decade. "With all due respect, sir," Kyle said carefully, "techniques evolve. What worked with iron sights and the rifles of that era doesn't necessarily translate to modern precision systems." Jean slid the notebook back into his pocket. "Would you like me to demonstrate?" Kyle hesitated. Around him, the other students had stopped pretending to work on their own positions. They were all watching now, sensing that something significant was unfolding. "Go ahead," Kyle said finally. "Let's see what that old technique can do." Jean settled back into his prone position, his movements slow but deliberate. He placed his left hand under the forestock of the rifle, then wrapped his thumb over the top of the handguard, pressing downward into the sandbag beneath. His breathing slowed. His body became still. At 300 yards, a steel silhouette target waited, roughly the size of a human torso. In the rising wind, it would be a challenging shot for most of the students present. Jean's finger took up the slack in the trigger. The rifle seemed to fire itself. The steel rang with the distinctive clang of a center hit before anyone had fully processed what happened. Without pausing, Jean worked the bolt, reacquired his sight picture and pressed the trigger again. Another hit, then another, then another. 5 shots in 12 seconds, all of them striking within a circle you could cover with your palm. The students erupted in murmurs of astonishment. Kyle said nothing. He was staring downrange at the target, his mind working through the implications of what he had just witnessed. Jean rose from his position with some difficulty, his knees protesting the cold ground. "The reason this grip works," he said, addressing not just Kyle but the entire line of students who had gathered closer, "is that it wasn't designed for speed or for tactical transitions. It was designed for one thing only: precision. Gunny Hathcock called it the dead hold. You press down on the forestock, driving it into your support. That eliminates the pulse you get from gripping with your fingers. It eliminates the micro-movements that come from muscular tension. When you're shooting at targets beyond 500 yards, when you're waiting hours for a single shot, you need a position you can hold without fatigue. This grip does that." Jean pulled a laminated photograph from his back pocket and handed it to Kyle. It showed a younger man in marine utilities, kneeling beside a tall, thin figure with a white feather tucked into his bush hat. Both men were holding rifles with the exact same hand position, thumb over bore, pressing down into the support. "Gunny told us the technique came from the competition shooters at Camp Perry," Jean continued. "Those men were drilling X-rings at 1,000 yards with iron sights before any of us were born. They figured out that relaxed pressure, consistent and repeatable, beats a death grip every single time. The modern C-clamp is fine for close quarters, for driving a carbine in a dynamic environment. But for precision work, for the kind of shooting where you get one chance, and the target is a half-mile away, the old way still has value." Kyle looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then he looked at Jean. The irritation was gone from his face, replaced by something that might have been humility. "I owe you an apology," Kyle said. "I dismissed your technique without understanding where it came from or why it works." Jean waved a hand. "You didn't know. Most people don't anymore. The men who use this grip in combat are almost all gone now. Gunny Hathcock passed in 1990s. The institutional knowledge goes with them unless someone bothers to preserve it." He paused, looking out at the distant targets. "That's why I'm really here. Not because I need to learn how to shoot. I needed to remind myself that the old ways still matter, and maybe teach a few young folks along the way." What happened next surprised everyone on that firing line. Kyle Mercer, the social media personality with thousands of followers, who hung on his every tactical tip, did something he had never done in 15 years of instruction. He asked to be taught. "Would you show me?" he asked Jean. "Show me exactly how Hathcock taught it?" Gene studied the younger man's face for a moment, perhaps looking for sincerity. Whatever he found, there seemed to satisfy him. "Get into position," Gene said. "I'll walk you through it the same way Gunny walked me through it 55 years ago." For the next hour, the scheduled curriculum was abandoned. Gene Harwell, the old man they had laughed at, became the instructor. He explained the biomechanics of the thumb-over-bore grip, how the downward pressure creates a skeletal lock rather than a muscular hold, how it allows the shooter to maintain position for extended periods without fatigue. He described how Hathcock had refined the technique during his 2 tours, in Vietnam, making incremental adjustments based on thousands of rounds fired in training and dozens fired in combat. He talked about the importance of natural point of aim, how the body should be positioned so that the rifle points at the target without any muscular effort, how the grip supports this rather than fighting against it. The students listened with an attention they hadn't shown all morning. Several of them tried the grip themselves, struggling at first with its counterintuitive nature before gradually feeling the stability it provided. One young man, a competitive shooter from Virginia, who had initially been among those snickering at Gene, found his groups tightening almost immediately. "It's like the rifle isn't moving at all," he said, wonder in his voice. Gene nodded. "That's the point. Gunny used to say the hardest thing about precision shooting isn't making the shot. It's making yourself still enough that the rifle can do what it was designed to do." By the end of the day, something had shifted at the Blue Ridge Shooting Academy. Kyle Mercer posted a video to his social media accounts that evening. It opened with a direct statement that surprised his followers. "Today I learned that I've been too quick to dismiss techniques I didn't understand," he said. "I met a man who was personally trained by Carlos Hathcock, and he showed me why certain methods that seem outdated still have tremendous value for precision shooting." The video went on to demonstrate the thumb-over-bore grip, with Kyle crediting Gene by name and including the story of how the technique connected back to the greatest sniper in Marine Corps history. Within a week, the video had been viewed over 2 million times. Comments flooded in from veterans who had learned the same grip decades ago, from competition shooters who had never abandoned it, and from a new generation of marksmen who had never known it existed. Gene Harwell returned to his small house in the North Carolina, foothills after the course ended. His grandson called to ask how it had gone. "Better than expected," Gene said, settling into his chair by the window where he could watch the ridgeline turn purple in the evening light. "I think I might go back next month. Kyle asked if I'd help teach a special session on traditional techniques." His grandson was quiet for a moment. "Grandpa, I just saw something online. Some instructor posted a video about you. It's everywhere. People are calling you a living legend." Gene considered this. He thought about Gunny Hathcock, about the quiet intensity of those training sessions half a century ago, about the way the man had moved and spoken and held his rifle with such complete mastery that it seemed like an extension of his body. "I'm no legend," Gene said finally. "I'm just a man who remembered what he was taught. The legend was Hathcock. I'm only keeping his memory alive." But in the weeks that followed, something remarkable happened. Veterans began reaching out to the Blue Ridge Shooting Academy, offering to share techniques they had learned from master shooters of previous generations. A network formed, connecting old knowledge with new students who were hungry to learn methods that had been forgotten or dismissed. Kyle Mercer changed the Academy's curriculum to include a module on historical shooting techniques, acknowledging that the evolution of the craft didn't mean the past had nothing to offer. And at the centre of it all, an old man with a worn notebook and a photograph of himself standing next to the white feather continued to teach anyone willing to listen. The thumb-over-bore grip is still not taught in most modern tactical courses. It remains specialised, suited for a particular type of shooting that values patience over speed and precision over volume of fire. But in the circles where long-range accuracy matters most, where shooters measure their success in fractions of an inch at distances measured in hundreds of yards, the old technique has found new respect. And if you ever find yourself at a range where an elderly shooter is gripping his rifle in a way that seems outdated, you might want to watch before you judge. You might be looking at someone who learned from the best there ever was. Carlos Hathcock believed that the most dangerous thing on any battlefield was a single patient man with a rifle. His students carried that lesson forward across generations. Every time one of them presses a thumb over the bore and settles into that dead hold he taught them, his legacy fires another round. The technique endures because it works. The memory endures because some lessons are too important to forget. If this story moved you, if you believe in honoring the veterans who carried rifles in defense of this nation, subscribe to this channel. We tell the stories of those who served, who sacrificed, and whose knowledge deserves to be preserved. Share this video with someone who loves shooting or who respects military history. And the next time you see an old-timer doing something that looks outdated, remember Gene Harwell. Remember the white feather. Remember that sometimes the old ways aren't obsolete. They're just waiting for someone humble enough to learn them again.